Hello everyone and welcome to a new video on my YouTube channel Anton GF. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez and I'm coming to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. This is a new episode of the Jazz Flashers podcast, and today we're not going to have a conversation with a jazz musician or any sort of interview. Today what we're going to have is a review of a record that has been recently reissued, and this is a record by one of my favorite jazz pianists of the present moment, one of the best Scandinavian jazz pianists, who is also one of the most sought after in Europe, with a varied discography ranging from traditional jazz trio albums to fine collaborations with jazz greats to more forward-looking projects. I'm talking about the Swedish jazz pianist Jan Lundgren. He has an incomparable sense of swing and a flair for what sounds just right when it comes to improvising. He has played with great names such as Arne Domnerus, Benny Golson, Johnny Griffin, Herb Geller, Bill Perkins, Conte Candoli, and the great Swedish pianist Bengt Hallberg. Let's remember that going back to the year 2011, they collaborated on an album called Back to Back. Jan Lundgren is the co-founder of the Ystad Jazz Festival in the region of Skåne in the south of Sweden, and he is also the musical director of Copenhagen's famous Jazzhus Montmartre. He's a major figure in European jazz, and he's always been one of my favorites, especially when it comes to albums like Swedish standards. On this one, he infuses Swedish folk songs with jazz rhythms, a little bit like Jan Johansson does on some of his albums. I love him also when it comes to live outings like Cooking at the Jazz Bakery, going back to the year of 1996. And he has also recorded some really interesting songbooks of lesser-known songwriters, such as Matt Dennis, for example, but also of other more celebrated songwriters, such as Julie Stein, Victor Young, and several others. Jan Lundgren was born in Kristianstad in the south of Sweden in 1966, and he is a classically trained pianist. His parents encouraged his interest in music early on, and as a teenager, he was introduced to jazz via Oscar Peterson's Night Train album, one of the classic albums in the Peterson discography. And in an interview that he did several years ago, about 8 years ago more or less, Lundgren himself talks about how important this record by Oscar Peterson was in his development as a jazz musician, because it showed him the way towards jazz. This is what Lundgren said several years ago about this meeting with the music of Oscar Peterson. How could this music be kept from me for 15 years? I'd never heard anything like it and was happy and angry at the same time. It was like falling in love. A bit like going on a school trip to somewhere like Turkey and meeting a Turkish girl who can't speak English. You don't understand a word she says, you just know you have to learn Turkish. I was 15 and had played the piano for 10 years, but this was a whole new language for me. When I listened to Oscar Peterson for the first time, I got the urge to learn this new language. It was then I realized that improvisation was a language. It gave my fingers wings. And definitely, improvisation is one of the key ingredients in Lundgren's approach to making music of any kind, but particularly when it comes to jazz. And this is evident in the Cole Porter songbook that we're going to be talking about more in depth on this episode of the Jazz Flashers podcast today. In fact, in that same interview, there's this very interesting quote by Lundgren himself on the subject of improvisation. And this is what Lundgren is quoted as saying on the topic of improvisation. Improvisation is like us sitting here talking. It's impulsive without reflection. We just let it spin. It's like speaking straight from the heart. But to improvise, you need to know the language. You have to have a language that you master. If you don't, then you can't improvise all the way. It's about nuances and their shifts. A word can have so many different meanings. And I find this comparison between improvisation and learning a foreign language or learning a language as though improvisation were a language unto itself. I find that extremely interesting. Really interesting. Now, through our common friend, Guy Jones, I was able to interview Jan Lundgren for a blog feature back in 2014. Wow, it's about 7, going on 8 years ago. And it was very interesting to me to get a chance to interview Jan, even though I wasn't really talking to him. I sent him the questions, and he responded. And some of his answers were really relevant. For example, he talked about the importance of being a classically trained pianist when playing jazz. And when I asked him about that, about how important it was to be a classically trained pianist to play jazz, I asked him, did this help you as a jazz performer? Was it ever an obstacle in your development as a jazz pianist? His response was clear. It helped enormously. You have to know your instrument and develop a good technique early. And that's exactly what a classical training provides. Also, during this interview, we talked about how he played with Arne Domnerus, and he had a lot of interesting and very positive things to say about Arne Domnerus, but he also talks a little bit about Johnny Griffin and Benny Golson, with whom he collaborated. But then one of the interesting things that I find about Jan Lundgren's music is how he draws this relationship between folk music from Sweden and jazz. And he talks about that when I asked him the question, what do Swedish folk music and jazz have in common, in your opinion? And his answer was the tones and melodies help. And there's a certain sort of melancholia in Swedish folk music that can work well as jazz or blues too. The minor mood of some of these songs is also connected to jazz. But my personal view is that you can adapt and transform any kind of music from any place in the world. Whether that transformation becomes jazz depends on the individual artist. So absolutely there is a connection in some of Lundgren's albums between Swedish folk music and jazz. He's not the first to have done this, but he is just another link in the chain of great performers that have explored the differences and also the connections between Swedish folk music and jazz. I also asked him during this interview back in 2014 about the relationship between Scandinavian countries and jazz. Why is there such an active jazz scene, and there has been a very active jazz scene in Scandinavia? Why does he think that this is so? And his response was, Sweden had a very strong jazz scene in the 1950s with a dominant position in youth culture. So it was easy for Americans to come here. People knew about them and their music. They gave them a lot of respect, and they treated them like real stars. Who wouldn't love that? They probably got paid pretty well too. And when it came to recommending another Swedish jazz musician that he particularly enjoys, his answer was also very clear. Lundgren recommended listening to the work of Swedish pianist Ben Hallberg, starting with his work from the 1950s. And definitely Hallberg has been a major influence on Jan Lundgren, and, well, he's also one of my favorites, so I do have to recommend his music to everybody out there. If you have not heard the music of Ben Hallberg, you definitely should. And Lundgren and Hallberg collaborated, as I said before, on an album called Back to Back, which is pure bliss, from 2011. Now, Jan Lundgren has recorded for many labels throughout the decades, including the Spain-based Fresh Sound Records. That's how I first heard of him, through some of the recordings he made for the Barcelona-based Fresh Sound Records. And the Stockholm-based Fog Arts label has been reissuing a number of hard-to-find and long-out-of-print Lundgren records as digital downloads for a while now. They're not CDs, they're not in physical format, but they can be found as digital downloads through Fog Arts. And all the information about how to find these albums and how to download these albums and where to get them will be in the description underneath this video. Some of these albums were originally recorded for the Japanese label Marshmallow and are now available for the first time in many years. Now, one of the latest ones to be reissued back in November of 2021, so just about a couple of months ago, is this album called the Jan Lundgren Trio Plays Cole Porter Love Songs, which finds Lundgren in a trio setting with Jesper Lundgaard on bass and Alex Reel on drums. It is a classic trio outing, piano, bass, and drums, recorded in March of 2006 at Sun Studio, not the one in Memphis, Tennessee, of course, but the one in Copenhagen in Denmark. And it focuses, as the title states, on love songs written by Cole Porter, many of which actually have the word love in the title. It is a kind of thematic songbook that shows how the rhythmic and harmonic complexities of Cole Porter's music can make a pianist of Lundgren's stature really thrive. It's a really interesting album, and that's why I wanted to talk about it today on this episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. And of course, I would like to recommend that you go out and try to find and download this album, recently reissued on Fog Arts. And let's talk a little bit about the content of this thematic Cole Porter songbook, concentrating not on any kind of Cole Porter songs, but specifically on his love songs. Starting off with I Love Paris, which is a great opener, played with intensity, but also with an easy swinging sense of joy. I think it's really one of the best ways to start the album. Really good choice as an album opener, I Love Paris. And right after that we get When Love Comes Around. The tempo slows down for this one. It's a lesser known Cole Porter gem, and it really is a jewel of a song. One of those songs you don't hear very often. A more intimate, more melancholy approach from Lundgren, who always knows what to do with a good ballad, and also is somebody who is interested in lesser known songwriters. And when it comes to better known songwriters like Cole Porter, he does like to dig real deep into their catalog to find songs like this one from Jubilee, When Love Comes Around. The next one is You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To. This is a jumpy mid-tempo take on a simple but witty Cole Porter song that I always associate with Frank Sinatra, because Sinatra included this on one of his Capitol Concept swinging albums, which is, if I'm not mistaken, A Swinging Affair from the 1950s. This shows that Jan Lundgren can be effortlessly subtle with this type of material, It is a mid-tempo take and done at a very subtly swinging pace. Really great performance from the trio on You'd Be So Nice to Come Home To. So in Love, the next track, is a highly dramatic Cole Porter composition, but from the introduction, as Jan Lundgren is alone at the piano, he stays away from the drama, turning the song into a self-reflexive, almost meditative number that works really perfectly in this context. This is something that happens on this album quite a bit. We get introductions to the tunes with Jan Lundgren alone at the piano, and then bass and drums come in to work together with the pianist, and their interactions are usually flawless and really interesting to listen to. The next song is At Long Last Love, one of many excellent Cole Porter list songs that Frank Sinatra always loved to perform in live appearances. And this really is one of my all-time favorite Porter numbers. Lundgren here smartly infuses this song with a Latin flavor that suits the melody just like a glove. This is a great reimagining of the tune by Jan Lundgren. This is a tune that has been played many, many times, and Lundgren is able to find some interesting angles to approach this number, At Long Last Love. The next one, What Is This Thing Called Love, has an intro by Lundgren that vaguely reminds me, at least, of George Gershwin's A Foggy Day in London Town. This doesn't last very long. The introduction sets this track up to be yet another meditative sort of number. But the trio increase the tempo soon into the performance and explore the contrast between the fast pace of the rhythm section and Lundgren's rather restrained playing, which is absolutely beautiful. So when we listen to this particular version of What Is This Thing Called Love, we find another wonderful reimagining of a classic Cole Porter track. Every Time We Say Goodbye comes next. Of course, Ella Fitzgerald does a fantastic job with this tune on her Cole Porter songbook for Verve Records, which was arranged by Buddy Brackman. And so does the lesser-known singer, but really interesting singer, Jerry Southern. On this album, Jan Lundgren takes this song, Every Time We Say Goodbye, at a slow tempo and plays it as it should be played, moving from a major to a minor key, as the original lyrics indicate. Some fine bass playing here, absolutely, by Lundgren, to embellish a lovely number, which is Every Time We Say Goodbye. The next one up is Love for Sale, one of Cole Porter's most risque songs due to its references to prostitution. Well, here it is given a sprightly treatment by the trio, complete with subtle changes of tempo that surprise the listener and keep the listener interested. Getting closer to the end of the album, Easy to Love is another beautiful song with a beautiful introduction as well that signals a change of tempo. It's a simple love song by Porter that is taken at a mid-tempo pace that suits it really well, with the bass supporting Lundgren's highly elegant playing. This is something that happens with Jan Lundgren along throughout many of his albums. The elegance of his playing is amazing. And to tell you the truth, the interaction here with the bass is something that turns this simple version of Easy to Love into an excellent track, a great moment on the album. True Love from the Bing Crosby and Grace Kelly film High Society. Of course, it also has Sinatra. It also has Louis Armstrong. It's a film, High Society, that came late in Cole Porter's career, and this is a tune that even Elvis Presley recorded for the Loving You album in 1957. Jan Lundgren accentuates the most basic notes of the melody. In fact, as you're listening to Jan doing this song on this album, you can almost sing along if you know the lyrics. I find myself singing along fairly easily with his performance because he accentuates the most basic notes of the melody. It is a very appealing piano solo track. There's no support here from Lundgren or from Rio. And this is a very simple song that Lundgren does in a straightforward way. And again, accentuates the beauty and the simplicity of the melody. And the album comes to a close with I Love You, another song that I associate, of course, like True Love with Bing Crosby. It has here a slow introduction that speeds up to mid-tempo when the bass and drums join in. It dispenses with the original Latin flavor of Porter's melody, at least the way that Crosby used to sing it. But it does explore the joy of the tune, and the rapport between piano and bass is particularly appealing here as the album comes to a close. A very recommendable album, as I have said before. This is just one of several digital download reissues by the Fog Arts label of albums that Jan Lundgren cut for the Japanese label Marshmallow between 2002 and 2011. There have been others reissued earlier in 2021. Albums with titles such as Lonely One, Les Parapluies de Cherbourg, or The Umbrellas of Cherbourg, in New York. And just a few weeks ago, in December 2021, we had the digital reissue of Blue Lights. There are still 4 more to come in the first half of 2022, and I'm really looking forward to these as well. A Swinging Rendezvous is one of them. We'll also have one entitled Charade, another one, Perfidia, which very likely is kind of like a Latin flavored album, or so I hope it is. And finally, Soft Summer Breeze is another album that Fog Arts are going to be reissuing digitally in the first half of 2022. This album by the Jan Lundgren Trio plays Cole Porter love songs, has great sound and some really interesting liner notes by noted jazz critic Doug Ramsey, featuring track-by-track commentary, and also these words by Jan Lundgren himself on what it felt like to work with this particular trio, with Lundgren and Rio. Jan Lundgren said about the trio, "Working with Jesper and Alex is always a pleasure. They must surely be regarded as one of the very best bass drums combos in the world. They have the knowledge and technique required to work in any situation, but will also always try to push the music a little bit further than expected." And this is something that, for sure, Jan Lundgren also tries to do whenever he's sitting at the piano, pushing the music a little bit further than expected. And the listeners, all of you out there, and myself right here, benefit from that. This is a wonderful album. The Jan Lundgren Trio plays Cole Porter love songs. Yet another Jan Lundgren songbook album to add to the fine ones that he has recorded on the work of Matt Dennis, Julie Stein, Victor Young, and several others. I just hope that my review, my comments on this album, on this episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast will make you feel interested in seeking out this album and any other album by Jan Lundgren, back to back with Ben Hallberg, Swedish standards, Cooking at the Jazz Bakery, any of his songbooks. In reality, any album by Jan Lundgren is interesting, and fortunately, Fog Arts is making many of them that had been long out of print finally available again as digital downloads. And for that, I would like to thank my good friend Guy Jones of Stockholm, Sweden, for the hard work that he puts into these reissues that actually show how much he loves jazz and how much he loves the music of the one and only Jan Lundgren. This has been a new episode of the Jazz Flashes podcast. My name is Anton Garcia Fernandez, coming to you from Jackson in the state of Tennessee in the United States of America. I recorded this new episode in the month of January of 2022, and very soon you'll be able to listen to this podcast on my YouTube channel, Anton GF. If you know the music of Jan Lundgren, leave some comments underneath. Maybe you know this album, this Cole Porter songbook. Maybe you know other albums by Jan Lundgren. I'd like to know which ones and why you like them, which ones are your favorites. Just leave some comments underneath the video, and I'll be very happy to read them and respond to them. Nothing else for now. Time to sign off here. Anton Garcia Fernandez saying goodbye from Jackson, Tennessee. And remember what I always say when I finish these Jazz Flashes podcast episodes. As old Duke Ellington and Billy Strayhorn used to say, it don't mean a thing if it ain't got that swing. So long, everybody, and thanks for your attention.